The long tables in the great hall have been dressed since noon. Linen cloths, the good ones, kept folded in a cedar chest, and brought out only for nights like this, cover the wood from end to end. Silver plate, polished until it throws back the torchlight in small hot flashes, is set at the high table for the Lord and his family and the guests who have ridden 2 days through frozen country to be here. Pewter, for everyone below the salt. The central hearth, a stone pit as wide as a small room, is stacked with split oak, burning at full roar, and the flames throw long orange shapes up the walls and across the tapestries that hang the full height of the hall. Red and gold and a blue, so dark it looks almost black. It is January of the year 1362 in the north of England, and tonight the household of Sir Robert de Harlow is holding a feast. Lady Cecily stands near the high table, in a gown of dark wool, dyed the colour of wine, trimmed at the neck and wrists with fur that catches the light every time she moves her arms. Her hair is bound and covered under a veil of fine linen, pinned with a silver clasp shaped like a hawk. She is speaking with a guest, a knight from a neighbouring estate, and she is smiling in the particular composed way of a woman who has managed a household through 11 winters and has learned exactly how much of herself to show in a room full of people who are, in one sense or another, always watching. The minstrels in the corner are tuning a viol. A servant moves along the table pouring wine that has been mulled with cinnamon and honey, the steam rising off the cups in thin curling ribbons. Somewhere below the hall, in the kitchens, meat is turning on a spit, and the smell of it, rich and roasting, drifts up the stairs and through the passage and into the hall itself, mixing with wood smoke and beeswax and the particular mineral smell of very old stone. It is, by any measure, a beautiful scene. It is the scene that 600 years of paintings and films and Christmas markets and fantasy novels have taught us to associate with the word castle firelight. Tapestries, fur and wine, and music. A world of stone and comfort, sealed against the winter, outside by walls 12 feet thick. And underneath all of that, underneath the silver plate and the mulled wine and the roaring hearth, this castle, on this night and on every night of this particular winter, is fighting a war it has already, the most basic sense, lost. Not a war against an invading army, a war against the cold. And it has been losing that war since October, and it will keep losing it until April. And everyone standing in this glowing, firelit hall, from Sir Robert at the high table to the boy turning the spit 2 floors below, already knows this, the way you know a fact about weather that no longer needs to be said aloud. The story of what it actually took to survive a winter inside a stone castle in the 14th century is far colder, far smokier, and far more physically demanding than any hall like this one has ever let on. There is a fantasy about castles that has settled deep into the modern imagination, and it has almost nothing to do with the buildings themselves. You have seen it in the seasonal market stalls selling mulled wine from pewter cups. You've seen it in the fantasy television shows where the great hall always glows gold and nobody's breath ever fogs. You have seen it in the phrase medieval feast, which conjures roaring fires and groaning tables and a warmth that feels, in the imagination, almost total. Here is the thing that fantasy leaves out entirely. A castle was not built to be warm, it was built to be defended. And those are not the same engineering problem. A castle wall is thick stone, sometimes 10 or 12 feet at the base, because thick stone stops a battering ram and absorbs the impact of a catapult. Nobody in the 14th century was solving for thermal comfort. They were solving for survival against siege, and the solution to that problem, in almost every particular, made the problem of staying warm dramatically worse. Stone does not insulate. Stone absorbs cold from the outside air and holds it, and then it radiates that cold back into every room it encloses, slowly, relentlessly, for the entire length of a northern winter. Windows, where they existed at all in the older parts of a keep like this one, were narrow arrow slits designed to let a bowman shoot out while presenting almost nothing to shoot back at. Glass was a luxury reserved for the newest and wealthiest buildings, and even where it existed, it did little to stop a determined draft. Most window openings in a castle of this age were covered, if they were covered at all, with oiled cloth or a wooden shutter, both of which let in more cold air than anyone would like to admit. This video is that admission. Not the polished, golden version of castle life that the modern imagination has built out of paintings and reenactments and fantasy fiction. The real one. The one that involved smoke hanging in the rafters, thick enough to sting your eyes, water freezing solid in a basin, 6 feet from a lit fire, and an army of servants whose entire winter existence was organized around one single, relentless task, keeping the people inside these walls from freezing. Consider, for a moment, just how strange this actually is once you sit with it directly. A castle represents one of the largest, most expensive, most labor-intensive building projects a medieval society could undertake, often requiring years of skilled masonry work and the resources of an entire region to complete. And after all of that investment, after all of those years of quarrying and hauling and shaping stone, the resulting structure was in the specific matter of keeping its occupants comfortably warm through an ordinary winter. And considerably less effective than a well-built peasant's timber cottage with a single hearth and a low thatched roof that trapped heat far more efficiently than any great hall ever could. Wealth and power in this specific and rather humbling sense bought defensibility and status and space, and none of those things reliably bought warmth. That contradiction sits at the center of everything we are about to explore tonight. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you prefer the real version to the polished one, take a second to subscribe. It helps us keep making these. And if you would like to, leave a comment telling me which era you find most fascinating. I read every one of them. Let us begin not in the hall where the fire is roaring and the wine is warm. Let us begin in the yard, in the freezing dark, where the castle's actual winter war was being fought, one armload of wood at a time. Let us begin with a girl carrying wood. Her name is. She is 17 years old, and she has worked in the household of Harlow Castle since she was 11, when her father, a mason who had spent 2 summers repairing the outer curtain wall, fell from the scaffolding and did not get back up. She remembers very little about that day, except the sound the household made when the news came through the gate, a kind of collective intake of breath, and the way her mother did not cry until 3 days later, alone, over the washing. Agnes's official position, if the word official means anything to a household that runs almost entirely on unwritten custom, is wood and fire servant. This means, in practice, that she is responsible for keeping timber moving from the woodyard to every hearth in the castle that needs feeding, which in January is every hearth in the castle, the great hall fire, the small fire in the steward's office, and most demanding of all, the private hearth in the solar, the chamber where Sir Robert and Lady Cecily sleep and dress and conduct the quiet business of family life, 3 floors up a spiral staircase that Agnes has climbed, by her own rough count, something close to 4,000 times in the 2 years since she was given this task. She is small for her age, 5 feet and perhaps an inch, with a build that a modern observer might call wiry, though nobody in this household has ever used that word. What they would notice, if they looked closely, which nobody does, is the strength in her forearms and shoulders, built entirely from carrying loads of wood up stone stairs for 2 winters running. What they would also notice, because it is harder to miss, are her hands. The skin across her knuckles is broken in several places, red and swollen at the joints, a condition the household calls chilblains, and that Agnes has simply come to think of as what January does. Her toes suffer the same condition inside her worn leather shoes. There is a cough, low and persistent, that settles into her chest every year around the solstice and does not fully clear until the weather turns in March. She carries one thing that belongs entirely to her, something she keeps in a small pouch sewn into the inside of her apron, close to her body, where she can feel its shape through the wool. It is a bird carved from a scrap of ash wood, no bigger than her thumb, its wings folded close and its head tilted slightly, as though listening for something. Her father made it for her the winter before he died, working at it by candlelight after the household's work was finished, and it is the only thing of his she has left. She does not show it to anyone. On the mornings when the staircase feels endless, when her arms are shaking under the weight of a load of wet oak and her lungs are burning with the cold, she presses her thumb against the smooth curve of the bird's wing through the fabric of her apron, and something in that small, repeated gesture steadies her enough to take the next step. This particular morning, the morning we are about to follow through an entire day and night in the depths of a 14th-century January, begins the way every morning in this household begins in the dark. Long before Sir Robert or Lady Cecily or any of the guests currently sleeping off last night's feast have opened their eyes. Agnes sleeps in the undercroft below the kitchens, a stone-vaulted room shared with 6 other menial servants, on a straw pallet laid directly on the floor. The undercroft is, by the standards of this castle, one of the warmer places to sleep, close as it is to the kitchen ovens above, but warmer is a relative term inside walls of solid stone in January. And this particular morning, Agnes wakes to find a thin crust of frost on the inside of the undercroft's small window opening, and her own breath rising in a visible cloud above her face in the darkness. Her position within the household did not come to her by any grand appointment. When her father died, her mother, left with 3 younger children and no income beyond what the castle's charity might provide, brought Agnes to the steward and asked plainly whether the household had any use for a girl of 11 willing to work. The steward, a sensible man who had watched more than one mason's family fall into genuine want after an accident on the scaffolding, found her a place among the youngest kitchen servants, work that mostly involved fetching and carrying and staying out of the way of the cooks. Over the following 6 years, as she grew and proved reliable and strong for her size, her duties shifted gradually toward the wood supply, first as one of several hands helping to move timber during the busiest weeks, and eventually, by the time she turned 15, as the servant primarily responsible for keeping every hearth in the castle fed. Nobody explained this promotion to her as an honor, and she did not experience it as one. It simply happened the way most things happen in a household run on custom and necessity rather than formal structure, because she had proven capable, and because the position needed filling, and because in the particular economy of a medieval castle, a capable pair of hands, she receives, in exchange for this labor, her keep, meaning food and a place to sleep and the castle's rough wool clothing, along with a small annual allowance that she sends, in part, to her mother, who still lives in the village beyond the castle walls with Agnes's 2 younger siblings. She does not think of her life in terms of hardship. exactly though a modern observer watching her climb the spiral stairs for the 11th time before noon might reasonably use that word. She thinks of it, when she thinks of it at all beyond the immediate demands of the task in front of her, as simply the shape her life has taken, the same shape her mother's life took before her, and her grandmother's before that. Women whose days were built around fire and water. There is no alternative she can imagine clearly enough to want it instead. There is only the work, and the winter, and the small, private comfort of a carved wooden bird pressed against her palm on the hardest mornings. There are, in truth, small pleasures scattered through even the hardest of her days, easy to overlook against the backdrop of relentless labor, but real nonetheless. The particular quality of light through the high hall windows on a clear morning, rare enough in this weather to feel like a small gift when it occurs. The taste of bread still warm from Osbert's ovens, eaten quickly between tasks. The sound of Joan's laughter, quick and unguarded, cutting through an otherwise silent afternoon in the undercroft when the two of them find a stolen moment to speak. These small things do not offset the exhaustion or the cold or the chilblains, and Agnes would never claim that they do. But they exist alongside the hardship, threaded through it, proof that a life this demanding is still, in its own way, a full human life, rather than simply a catalogue of suffering, however much the labor dominates its shape. The day that is about to begin will ask everything of her body that yesterday asked, and the day before that, and every day going back to October. It will not end until long after the household has gone to bed. If you imagine the great hearth of a medieval hall, you probably picture something close to what we saw a moment ago. A roaring, generous fire, throwing heat across the entire room, warming everyone within its glow. That image is not entirely false. The fire in the Harlow Great Hall really was that large, really did burn that hot, really did throw that much orange light up the walls. What the image leaves out is what happens to that heat and that smoke once the fire is lit. Begin with the smoke. The great hall hearth is a stone pit set into the floor near the center of the room, not built into a wall with a proper chimney flue the way a modern fireplace would be. This is not unusual for a hall of this size and this age. Central hearths were the standard in halls built a century or more earlier, and even in the newer wings of Harlow Castle, where wall fireplaces with rudimentary flues have started to appear, the old Great Hall keeps its central pit. Because rebuilding an entire hall around a new heating system is an enormous undertaking that nobody has yet found the money or the urgency to complete. What this means, in practice, is that the smoke from the fire has nowhere organized to go. It rises straight up toward the high timber roof, and it hangs there, in the upper reaches of the hall, in a slowly thickening layer that never fully clears as long as the fire burns. If you were to stand on a platform near the roof beams, which nobody does, you would find the air seriously dangerous to breathe, thick with wood smoke that has nowhere to escape, except through a few small vents called louvers, set into the roof itself, wooden structures with angled slats designed to let smoke drift out while keeping rain from drifting in. The louvers help. They do not solve the problem. On a still night, with no wind to pull the smoke through the vents, the layer of haze in the upper hall grows thick enough to see clearly from the floor, a grey ceiling hanging 20 feet above the tables, catching the torchlight and giving the whole room a strange, tazy glow that a modern visitor would find beautiful and a modern doctor would find alarming. Everyone in the hall breathes this air for hours at a time, every single day, all winter long. Eyes sting, throats grow raspy. The household's older members cough more in winter than in summer, and though nobody in 1362 would connect this pattern to wood smoke in any scientific sense, everybody understands in a general and common sense way that the Great Hall in deep winter is a place where the air itself feels heavy, and that spending an entire evening near the hearth means going to bed with eyes that ache and a throat that feels scraped raw. The soot from all of that smoke settles everywhere. On the timber roof beams, which are black with decades of accumulated char by this point, so thoroughly darkened that nobody remembers what color the raw wood originally was on the stone walls above the tapestries. On the tapestries themselves, along their upper edges, where a faint grey film builds up year after year, no matter how carefully the household servants beat and brush the fabric each spring. Even on the silver plate, which requires constant polishing, not just for the sake of appearances, but because a film of soot settles onto every exposed surface in the hall within days of a fire being lit and left to burn. Now, the heat itself. Here is the detail that the fantasy version of castle life gets most wrong. A fire this size, burning in the center of a room this large, with a ceiling that rises 30 feet or more to the roof timbers, does not warm the room the way a modern heating system warms a modern house. Creates a small, intense zone of genuine warmth immediately around the hearth, perhaps a radius of 8 or 10 feet, where a person standing close enough can actually feel their hands and face growing warm. Beyond that radius, the heat falls away with startling speed. A guest seated at the high table 20 feet from the fire feels its glow and its light, but very little of its actual warmth, particularly in the lower half of the body, where the cold radiating up from the stone floor competes directly with whatever heat manages to drift across the room. A servant standing against the far wall, 50 or 60 feet from the hearth, might as well be standing outside, given how little of the fire's heat reaches that distance. This is why every person in this hall tonight, from Sir Robert at the high table to the lowest servant against the wall, is wearing heavy wool, not as a fashion choice, as a survival strategy that operates in parallel with the fire, rather than depending on it entirely. The fire provides light and status and a focal point for the room, and a modest amount of genuine heat within its immediate radius. It does not and cannot warm a hall this size the way a modern person imagines a fireplace warming a modern living room. Agnes knows all of this, not as abstract information, but as a fact lodged in her body. She is the one who tends this fire before dawn, raking the previous night's ash, laying new kindling, coaxing flame from banked coals in the freezing pre-dawn hall, while her breath fogs in front of her face and her fingers, already stiffening with chilblains, struggle to grip the smaller pieces of kindling. She knows exactly how long it takes for the hall to feel even marginally warmer once the fire catches. Roughly 2 hours of steady burning before the stone itself begins to give back even a fraction of the heat it has absorbed. She knows which parts of the hall never warm at all, no matter how long the fire burns: the far corners, the space near the main doors, the stone floor itself, which stays cold enough to numb the feet through even the thickest leather shoes. She lays the fire this morning in the dark, working by touch and memory more than sight. And by the time the first grey light comes through the high windows, the fire is burning steadily, and the hall is beginning its long, losing battle against the cold for another day. The rushes scattered across the hall's floor, a common functional covering in a building without carpets or finished flooring throughout most of its space, add their own dimension to this daily struggle. Fresh rushes, laid over the stone in autumn and periodically refreshed through the winter, provide a modest degree of insulation against the floor's relentless cold, along with absorbing spilled food and drink from the household's meals in a way that makes the floor easier to keep reasonably clean. But rushes decay slowly over the weeks between changes, and by late January, the layer covering the great hall floor has begun to compress and darken, mixed with ash tracked from the hearth and scraps from the previous week's meals adding its own faint, earthy smell to the general atmosphere of the hall. One more sensory detail that the romantic imagination of castle life has quietly edited out of the picture, along with the smoke and the cold and the soot on the tapestries. Agnes is not responsible for the rushes, a task that falls to a different servant entirely, but she notices them each morning. She crosses the hall toward the hearth, feeling the slight give and rustle underfoot that distinguishes this floor from the bare and forgiving stone of the stairwells. It is a small mercy, this layer between her feet and the true cold of the floor beneath, and she has learned, the way she has learned to notice every small variation in temperature and comfort across her working day, to appreciate it without ever having words for what exactly she is appreciating. Tapestries are not primarily art. This is a hard thing for the modern imagination to accept, conditioned as it is by museum galleries, where these same objects hang under careful lighting, roped off, admired for their craftsmanship and their storytelling and their sheer scale. But strip away 600 years of that museum context and look at a tapestry the way the people of Harlow Castle actually looked at it in 1362, hanging on a cold stone wall in January, and you find something considerably more functional hiding underneath the artistry. A tapestry castle like this one was insulation. The stone walls of the great hall are not solid from floor to ceiling. They are pierced at intervals by the narrow arrow-slit windows we mentioned earlier, and by gaps and seams in the stonework itself that no amount of careful masonry can fully eliminate. Cold air finds every one of those openings. It pours through the arrow slits on a windy night with a force that can make a hung tapestry visibly ripple, and it seeps through smaller cracks in the mortar with a steady, invisible persistence that a person standing near the wall can feel as a distinct, localized chill. Without something covering that stone, the draft would be constant and severe, cutting across the hall at ankle height and shoulder height alike, undermining whatever warmth the fire manages to produce. The tapestry solves this problem the same way any thick, hanging fabric solves it. It creates a barrier of trapped still air between the cold stone and the room itself. A heavy wool, opal and silk tapestry, several layers thick in its weave, hung a few inches off the wall on wooden battens, breaks the direct path of the draft and insulates the stone's radiating cold in a way that bare masonry. This is why the tapestries in the Great Hall hang floor to ceiling, covering as much wall surface as the household can afford to cover, rather than being displayed as isolated art pieces, the way a modern gallery might present them. Coverage, not composition, is the governing principle. This does not mean the artistry was incidental. The scenes woven into these particular tapestries, the hunting party pursuing a stag through a forest rendered in threads of green and brown, the battle scene with its riders in blue and silver, a religious scene showing a saint in robes of deep red, represent months or years of skilled labor by weavers in workshops far from Harlow. And they were extraordinarily expensive, often worth more than the furniture in an entire room. Sir Robert's father purchased the hunting tapestry as a young man from a merchant who had brought it from Flanders, and it remains one of the most valuable objects in the entire castle. Status and insulation were never separate functions here. A wealthy household demonstrated its wealth partly through the sheer quantity of warm, expensive fabric it could afford to hang on its walls, and a household that could not afford tapestries made do with whitewashed plaster or bare stone, and suffered the draft accordingly, in direct proportion to its poverty. Agnes's relationship with the tapestries is entirely physical rather than aesthetic. Twice a year, in spring, and again before the deepest cold sets in each autumn, the household servants take the tapestries down for beating and airing. a task that requires several people working together, because a single hunting tapestry of this size weighs enough that one person alone cannot safely manage it without risking a tear in fabric that took a weaver a year or more to complete. Agnes has helped with this task each of the 2 autumns she has worked here, straining under the weight of rolled wool fabric, carrying it out to the yard where it can be beaten with wooden paddles to shake loose the accumulated dust and soot, and then carrying it back in and rehanging it on the battens. A job that leaves her shoulders aching for days afterward. She has also, on several occasions, been sent to check the tapestries during a storm when Sir Robert or the steward wants to know whether a particular section of wall is admitting more draught than usual. She presses her palm flat against the back of the fabric, feeling for the telltale coldness that means the wind has found a gap the tapestry is not fully covering. And she reports back, and sometimes a servant is sent to stuff rags or straw into the offending crack in the stonework behind a hanging. A temporary patch on a problem that will never be permanently solved, because the castle's walls, however thick and however well built, are simply not designed to keep this particular enemy out. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely. The rich, glowing tapestries that decorate every romantic image of medieval life were doing quiet, essential, unglamorous work every hour they hung on that wall, standing between the household and a cold that would otherwise have made the great hall truly unlivable for months at a time. The beauty was real. The beauty was also, in the most literal sense, a byproduct of a desperate and largely successful engineering solution to a problem that the castle's own thick stone walls had created in the first place. There is a further wrinkle to this story that the household understands intuitively, even if nobody has ever articulated it in quite these terms. The tapestries are not distributed evenly through the castle, according to which walls face the coldest exposure. They are distributed according to rank. The Great Hall, where guests are entertained and where the household status is most visibly performed, receives the finest and most numerous hangings, the hunting scene, the battle scene, the saint in red robes, each one a significant investment. The solar, private as it is, makes do with a smaller number of somewhat plainer hangings, functional rather than ostentatious, since fewer eyes will ever see them. And the servants' quarters, the undercroft where Agnes sleeps, have no tapestries at all, only bare stone and whatever the residual warmth of the kitchen above can provide. This distribution makes a certain brutal sense within the household's own logic. Resources flow toward visibility and status, and a tapestry hung in a room nobody of consequence ever enters delivers no return on the household's investment beyond the functional insulation itself, which the household values considerably less than the social value the same object provides in a room full of guests. Agnes, sleeping in an undercroft with bare stone walls that hold the cold far more directly than the tapestry-hung chambers above her, experiences the sharp end of this calculation. It is simply, again, the shape of things, the same unequal distribution of comfort that governs every other aspect of life inside these walls. The household does possess a small number of older, more worn tapestries, retired from the Great Hall's display after years of accumulated soot and fading color, rendered them no longer suitable for a space where guests would see them, and these sometimes find their way to more functional use, hung as rough partitions in colder storage areas or, occasionally, cut down and repurposed as heavier bedding. For whichever member of the household happens to need the extra warmth most urgently in a given week. Nothing woven from wool at this level of expense is ever discarded outright. Simply moves over years and sometimes decades from the most visible and valued spaces toward the most functional and hidden ones, tracing in its own slow decline the same hierarchy of comfort that governs every warm object in this entire castle. There is a particular piece, a smaller fragment cut some years ago from a tapestry too damaged by damp to hang whole any longer, that has found its way through a series of small decisions nobody would call deliberate policy into the undercroft itself. Draped now across the coldest section of wall nearest the small window opening where Agnes and the others sleep. It is faded nearly beyond recognition, its once vivid greens and reds reduced to a uniform muddy brown, and none of the servants sleeping under it could tell you what scene it originally depicted. But it blocks a portion of the draught that would otherwise cut directly across their sleeping space. And for that reason alone, worn and faded, and utterly without status as it is, it represents one of the Undercroft's few genuine comforts. Humble destination for an object that began its life as one of the most expensive things this household ever purchased. If you picture a servant fetching firewood, you are probably picturing something small, a quick errand. An armload of dry logs carried in from a shed a few steps from the kitchen door, a task that takes a few minutes and barely interrupts the flow of a day. The reality at Harlow Castle, and at every castle of comparable size across Northern Europe in this era, is a logistics operation on a scale that most modern people would find hard to believe. A castle household in deep winter does not consume firewood in armloads. It consumes firewood in cartloads, delivered continuously week after week, at a rate that a modern visitor might reasonably describe as forest-level demand. Consider what actually needs to burn every single day for this household to function. The great hall hearth, which we have already discussed, burns from before dawn until well after the household retires, consuming a steady diet of split oak logs for something close to 16 hours a day. The kitchen ovens and cooking fires, which never fully go cold in winter because bread must be baked and meals must be prepared for dozens of people every single day, consume their own substantial supply. The solar, where Sir Robert and Lady Cecily spend their private hours, has its own hearth, smaller than the hall's, but still demanding several substantial logs a day to maintain even a modest warmth. The steward's office, the chapel, in the days it is used, small embrasures in various passages and stairwells during the coldest weeks. Add all of this together, and the castle's daily wood consumption in January reaches a volume that requires, by the household steward's own reckoning, something close to an entire, mature oak tree's worth of timber every single week, cut, split, seasoned, and hauled into the castle from the estate's own woodland. This is not a task performed by one person, or even by a handful of people working occasionally. It is the full-time occupation of several men through the autumn months, when the actual felling and splitting takes place in the woodland a mile or so beyond the castle walls, and it remains a demanding daily task throughout winter when the seasoned wood must be continuously moved, sorted by size and purpose, and distributed to every hearth that needs feeding. The woodyard sits just inside the castle's outer wall, a walled enclosure open to the sky, stacked with cords of split timber, arranged in long rows to allow air to circulate and prevent rot. In deep winter, this yard is one of the coldest working spaces in the entire castle complex, fully exposed to the wind, with a stone floor that holds the frost long after the sun, on the rare days it appears at all, has climbed above the walls. This is where Agnes's morning properly begins, after the great hall fire has been laid and lit, and before the household has fully woken. The wood itself presents its own particular cruelty in weather like this. Timber that has been properly seasoned through the summer and autumn burns cleanly and efficiently, but seasoned wood stored outdoors through a wet, snowy winter absorbs moisture from the air and from any snow or sleet that finds its way past the yard's low roof covering. Wet wood is heavier to carry than dry wood, sometimes significantly so, and it is also colder to the touch, a fact that matters enormously when the person carrying it has bare or thinly gloved hands that are already suffering from chilblains. Agnes's hands, by the third week of January, have developed a particular relationship with cold, wet oak. She knows exactly how the surface of a damp log feels against skin that is already cracked and swollen, a specific, sharp discomfort that she has stopped consciously registering as pain and has simply absorbed into the background texture of her working day. The physical labor of the woodyard breaks down into several distinct tasks, each with its own toll on the body. Splitting larger logs into fireplace-sized pieces, a task usually reserved for the stronger men of the household, but occasionally falling to Agnes when hands are short, requires swinging a heavy axe with enough force and enough accuracy to cleave a piece of oak along its grain. A skill that takes strength most people underestimate, and that leaves the forearms and shoulders burning after even a modest session. Stacking, which sounds simple, but which requires careful arrangement to prevent a pile from collapsing and to allow air circulation that keeps the wood from rotting, is tedious, repetitive, and performed with hands that grow number by the hour in cold air. Carrying, which is the task that consumes the largest share of Agnes's actual working day, requires loading an arm load or a wood-carrying frame with as much timber as the body can manage and moving it from the yard to wherever in the castle it needs to go. A single load, the amount Agnes typically carries, in one trip, weighs somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds, depending on the size and dampness of the pieces. She makes this trip, on an average January day, somewhere between 15 and 20 times, distributing wood to the hall, the kitchens, the solar, and the smaller fires scattered through the castle's occupied rooms. This means that over the course of a single winter day, Agnes personally carries something in the neighborhood of 600 to 800 pounds of wood, much of it up flights of stone stairs, in temperatures that regularly sit at or below freezing, with hands that are already damaged from the previous weeks of identical labor. And critically, everybody around her in this position is doing the same. Agnes is not an anomaly within the household structure. She is one of several servants whose entire winter existence is organized around this single, relentless, physically punishing task. A labor force whose work is essential to every comfort the household above them enjoys, and whose own comfort, in return, is almost entirely absent from the equation. They do not sit by the fires they build. They build them and carry the fuel that sustains them and move on to the next task and the next, until the light fails and the day's demand for warmth has, for a few hours, been satisfied. The sourcing of this wood is its own year-round undertaking, one that begins long before the first frost of any given winter. Harlow Castle's estate includes a substantial tract of managed woodland, coppiced and felled on a rotating schedule that the steward and the estate woodward, a man who has spent his entire working life managing this single resource, plan out years in advance. Trees are felled in the autumn after the sap has withdrawn and the wood has begun its natural process of drying, and the timber is split into manageable lengths and stacked in the woodyard to season through the following months, ideally for a full year or more before it burns cleanly. This is the theory at least, and in a well-managed year, with adequate labor and favorable weather, the household enters winter with a substantial reserve of properly seasoned, dry timber. This particular winter has not been a well-managed year in every respect. An unusually wet autumn delayed the felling schedule by several weeks, and a portion of what should have been a full season of drying was compressed into considerably less time. The result, felt directly in Agnes's hands every single day, is a wood supply that burns less efficiently than it should, producing more smoke and less heat for the same volume of timber and requiring more frequent tending to keep any given fire burning at a useful strength. The steward is aware of this problem. He has already begun quiet calculations about whether the estate's reserves will stretch through to April. Calculations that weigh heavily on him, in a way that rarely reaches the ears of the household's more comfortable inhabitants, but that shape very direct ways how generously any given fire in this castle. Agnes feels the consequences of this shortfall directly, though nobody has explained the underlying cause to her in so many words. She has simply noticed over the past several weeks that the wood reaching her from the yard seems heavier and colder to the touch than in previous winters, that it hisses and spits more than it should when first laid on a fire, that the flames it produces seem to require more coaxing and more attention to sustain. She has adapted her technique accordingly, without ever framing the adjustment in her own mind as a response to a supply problem. She simply works a little harder, tends each fire a little more carefully, because the wood itself has become, in some small but persistent way, a little more difficult to work with this particular year. The tools of her trade, if the word tools can be stretched to cover the simple, well-worn implements available to a wood servant of her rank, are themselves a source of quiet daily frustration this winter. The wood-carrying frame she uses for her heaviest loads, a wooden yoke fitted across her shoulders with rope loops on either side to hold bundled timber, has a cracked fitting on its left side that the castle's carpenter has promised to repair for weeks now, a promise repeatedly delayed by more urgent demands on his time. In the meantime, Agnes compensates by shifting more weight onto her right shoulder than the frame's design intends, a small daily accommodation that has begun, over the accumulated weeks of winter, to produce its own persistent ache along the right side of her neck. One more entry in the long, done-recorded ledger of small physical costs that this work extracts from her body, week after week, season after season. I want you to sit with this for a moment. Not just hear it and move on, but actually imagine what it would feel like in your own body. Imagine carrying 50 pounds of wet oak up a freezing spiral staircase in near darkness, knowing you have to make this same climb at least 10 more times before the noon meal. The staircase itself is a marvel of defensive architecture and a genuine hazard to anyone using it in these conditions. Spiral staircases were built into medieval castles for a specific tactical reason that has nothing to do with the comfort of the people who would climb them daily for the rest of their working lives. A spiral stair, turning clockwise as it rises, gives a defender standing above a significant advantage over an attacker climbing from below, because the attacker's sword arm, for a right-handed fighter, is pressed against the central stone column and restricted, while the defender's arm swings free. This is brilliant defensive design. It is also, for a servant carrying an armload of firewood, a narrow, uneven, twisting climb where each stone step is a slightly different height and depth than the last, worn smooth and slightly concave in the center from centuries of feet, and treacherously slick wherever damp has found its way in from a window slit or a leaking roof above. Agnes makes this specific climb from the wood yard to the solar 3 floors above, more times each day than she has ever bothered to count precisely, though she once tried, out of a kind of grim curiosity, and lost track somewhere past a dozen before the cold in her fingers made counting anything feel impossible. The stairs themselves are unlit, except for the thin grey daylight that filters through occasional arrow-slit windows set into the outer wall of the stairwell. And in the early morning, before full daylight, and in the evening, after it has faded, she climbs almost entirely by feel, one hand trailing along the cold curve of the central stone column, the other arm wrapped around a bundle of wood held tight against her chest. And the wood was wet, and the stairs were steep, and the wind cut through the wool of her kirtle at every arrow slit she passed, and her breath came in short clouds that she could see even in the dim light, and her chest, by the 5th or 6th climb of the morning, had begun its familiar tight ache, the one that would settle into a full cough by evening and stay there, more or less permanently, until March. The physical toll of this specific task, the stair climbing under load, is distinct from the toll of the woodyard itself, and in some ways worse. Carrying a heavy, awkward load up an uneven, spiraling stone staircase requires a kind of full-body engagement that flat ground does not demand. The thighs and calves bear the weight of each upward step. The core muscles brace constantly against the twisting motion of the spiral, correcting for balance with every turn. The arms, already fatigued from carrying and loading wood in the yard below, must maintain their grip on the load through the entire climb, because dropping a bundle of wood on these narrow stairs risks not just the wood itself, but a serious fall, one that could easily break a bone or worse, given the unforgiving stone underfoot and the tight, twisting geometry of the space. Agnes's knees, by 17, already carry the beginning of a condition that a modern physician would recognize instantly, and that nobody in this castle has any name for at all: a persistent ache and occasional grinding sensation. The same way she has learned to work through the chilblains and the cough and the constant low-grade exhaustion that has become the baseline condition of her body every winter since she was old enough to be given this task. And here is the detail that the romantic image of castle life is most determined to leave out entirely. Agnes, who spends more hours of her day feeding fires than anyone else in this entire household, rarely gets to sit beside one. She delivers the wood to the solar hearth and leaves again, because there is more wood waiting in the yard below, and more hearths waiting to be fed, and no time built into her day for lingering near the warmth she herself has created. Her own warmth, such as it is, comes almost entirely from the exertion of the climb itself, the heat her body generates through sheer physical labor, which fades the moment she stops moving and stands, even briefly, in one of the castle's many freezing passages. The fires that make this castle glow with warmth and comfort in every romantic imagining of medieval life are built, maintained, and fed by people who experience almost none of that warmth themselves. Their comfort comes from motion, from labor, from the simple, brutal fact that a body working hard enough generates its own heat for as long as the body keeps moving, and not one moment longer. There is a further cruelty built into the geometry of this particular staircase that deserves its own mention, because it compounds every other difficulty we have already discussed. The stairs at Harlow Castle turn in the traditional clockwise direction as they rise, favoring a right-handed defender, which means that anyone climbing while carrying a load in their right arm, the natural and dominant arm for the majority of people, is forced to press that load against the outer curve of the stair, rather than resting it against the reassuring solidity of the central stone column. Agnes has learned, through simple repetition rather than any instruction, to carry her wood bundled against her left side instead, freeing her right hand to trail along the newel post for balance and support. A small adaptation that shifts the strain unevenly through her body, so that her left shoulder and left forearm bear a disproportionate share of the daily burden compared to her right. The unevenness shows, if anyone cared to look closely enough to notice, in the slightly different muscle development between her two arms, a permanent physical record of thousands of climbs made the same way, day after day, for 2 years running. The stairwell itself offers no true landing or resting point between floors, only the narrow window slits set at intervals into the outer wall, openings barely wide enough to admit a hand, let alone offer any meaningful shelter from the climb. On the coldest mornings, when the wind finds its way through these slits with particular force, Agnes has learned exactly which steps place her most directly in the path of the draft, and she has learned, too, to time her breathing around those specific points in the climb. Holding a breath through the worst of the cold blast, rather than drawing frigid air directly into lungs already laboring under the exertion of the climb itself. This is not a technique anyone taught her. It is the kind of small, ordinary adaptation that accumulates naturally in a body that repeats the same demanding task. Often enough, the same way a laborer's hands eventually learn, without conscious thought, exactly how much force a given task requires. By mid-morning, on a typical January day, Agnes has usually completed something close to half of her total climbs for the day, and her body has settled into a particular rhythm of controlled exhaustion that she has come to recognize as simply the way mornings feel. Her breath comes short. Her legs carry a persistent low burn in the thighs and calves that never fully resolves between climbs, only eases slightly before building again on the next ascent. Her hands, gripping whatever load she carries, have long since passed the point of feeling the individual pieces of wood as distinct objects, registering instead only the general undifferentiated pressure and cold of the bundle against her chest and forearm. This is the physical reality that underlies every warm room in this castle. Every glowing hearth that a guest at last night's feast might have admired without a single thought for how the fire came to be burning in the first place. For Sir Robert and Lady Cecily, meanwhile, winter presented a different version of the same problem, one that money and status could soften, but never fully solve. The solar sits on the third floor of the keep's private range, a chamber reserved for the Lord and Lady's use, separate from the Great Hall, considerably smaller, which is itself part of the point. A smaller room is easier to heat than a vast hall, and the solar's hearth, though modest compared to the one below, works harder in proportion to the space it needs to warm. This is, by any reasonable standard within this castle, the most comfortable private room available to anyone living here. It is also, by any modern standard, bitterly cold for most of the winter, in ways that even wealth and privilege cannot fully correct. Consider the basin. Every morning, a servant, usually Agnes or one of the other junior household staff, brings a ewer of water up to the solar for Sir Robert and Lady Cecily to wash. This water is drawn fresh, sometimes warmed briefly near a kitchen fire before the climb, but by the time it reaches the solar and sits in the basin overnight, or even for a few hours during a particularly cold stretch of the day, it can freeze. Not merely chill, freeze solid, a thin sheet of ice forming across the surface that must be broken before the water underneath can be used at all. This happens in the private chamber of one of the wealthiest families in the region, a room with its own dedicated hearth and a fire that burns for most of the day. Wealth in this castle does not buy warm water on a January morning. It buys water that freezes a little more slowly, and a servant close enough to reach with a small stick to break the ice before pouring. The clothing worn inside this supposedly comfortable private chamber tells the same story. Sir Robert, even indoors, even seated near his own private hearth, wears a heavy wool tunic, often lined with fur at the collar and cuffs, over a linen undershirt with thick woolen hose covering his legs from ankle to thigh, and frequently a fur-lined mantle or cloak thrown over the whole arrangement when he is not actively working near the fire itself. Lady Cecily's layering is, if anything, more extensive. A linen chemise against the skin, a woolen kirtle over that, often a second, heavier woolen gown over the kirtle, and in the coldest weeks, a fur-lined mantle pinned at the shoulder, worn continuously through the day, removed only when she retires to bed, and even then, often replaced with a heavy woolen bedgown rather than discarded entirely. This is not fashion in the sense a modern observer might assume, an aristocratic performance of wealth through excessive layering. It is, first and fundamentally, thermal survival, and the fact that it also displayed wealth was a secondary benefit rather than the primary purpose. The furs Sir Robert and Lady Cecily wear, Miniver and Martin and Fox, are expensive, yes, and they signal status clearly to anyone who sees them. They are also in a stone chamber where the temperature rarely climbs much above what a modern person would consider seriously uncomfortable, functionally necessary, a way that a peasant's cheaper, thinner wool simply could not match. The nobility were not choosing discomfort for the sake of fashion. They were solving the exact same problem that Agnes and every other servant in this castle was solving, with better materials and considerably more of them. But the underlying problem, the relentless, inescapable cold radiating from every stone surface in the building, remained precisely the same problem for everyone, regardless of rank. There is a genuine paradox worth sitting with here. Sir Robert de Harlow commands a household of dozens, holds land across 3 counties, and could, if he chose, spend a fortune on any comfort available in the 14th century. And none of that wealth, none of that power could purchase a room that was simply comfortably warm the way a modern person understands warmth. The best that money could buy in this world, in this century, was a room that was less cold than the rooms below it. A fire that burned a little longer, in a chamber a little smaller, tended by servants whose labor never stopped. Furs a little thicker, wool a little finer, layered a little more generously than what a servant could afford. But the fundamental physics of a stone building in a northern winter did not bend for rank. Sir Robert's hip, injured years ago in a hunting accident, now aching with a deep, grinding persistence in cold weather that his physician has no real remedy for beyond willow bark, and patience throbs just as insistently in his fur-trimmed solar. The cold in this one specific and rather remarkable sense was the great equalizer of this castle. It did not care about silver plate or tapestries from Flanders. It found its way into every room and every body, regardless of what that body was wearing. Lady Cecily's own relationship with the winter cold carries its own particular texture, shaped by the specific responsibilities that fall to her as mistress of this household. Where Sir Robert's authority extends outward toward the estate's tenants and the management of land and rent, Lady Cecily's authority governs the household's interior functioning almost entirely, and this means that she, more than her husband, understands in granular, hands-on detail exactly what winter costs this castle in fuel, in food. Down to the health and endurance of the servants who keep it running. She reviews the steward's tallies of wood consumption. She consults with Osbert on the state of the food stores. She is the one who decides, on a morning when a servant appears visibly unwell, whether that servant should be permitted to rest, or whether the household's needs require them to continue working regardless. This responsibility sits on her with a weight that her husband's public role does not entirely share, precisely because it deals in such immediate, unglamorous particulars. Sir Robert can speak in the abstract terms of estate management, of rents and obligations, and the broader strategic concerns of his position in the region's noble hierarchy. Lady Cecily deals daily in the specific, physical reality of whether there is enough wood, enough grain, enough dry clothing, enough of everything a household this size requires simply to survive until spring. And she carries the private knowledge, rarely spoken aloud even to her husband, of exactly how thin some of those margins have grown this particular winter, thanks to the delayed harvest and the compressed wood seasoning schedule that Osbert and the steward have already begun quietly worrying over. She has, on more than one occasion this winter, quietly redirected a portion of her own household allowance toward additional wood purchases from a neighboring estate. A decision she has not discussed with Sir Robert, partly because the sum involved is modest enough not to warrant his attention, and partly because she has learned, across 11 years of marriage, her husband trusts her judgment on these interior matters completely, and prefers not to be troubled with the details, so long as the household continues to function as it should. This quiet, unacknowledged stewardship, invisible to any guest who might attend a feast in the great hall and see only the finished result, warm enough hospitality, food enough to feed dozens, represents its own form of the same labor that Agnes performs on the stairs, simply exercised through management and calculation, but no less essential to the household's survival for the difference. Which brings us, naturally, to the question of how anyone in this castle managed to sleep at all. If you picture a medieval great bed, the kind depicted in paintings and museum reconstructions, you are probably picturing an impressive piece of furniture, tall carved posts, rich fabric hangings, an object designed primarily to display wealth and status to anyone who entered the chamber. That impression is not wrong, exactly. It is simply incomplete because it treats the bed curtains as decoration when their actual function was closer to survival equipment. Sir Robert and Lady Cecily's bed sits against the interior wall of the solar, the wall shared with the stairwell, rather than the wall facing outward toward the cold stone of the castle's exterior, a deliberate choice that offers a small additional degree of protection from the worst of the draught. The bed frame itself is substantial, built from oak, standing perhaps 3 feet off the ground on its own legs, which keeps the sleeping surface clear of the coldest air that pools near a stone floor. Mattress stuffed with wool sits atop a webbing of rope strung across the frame, and this mattress is covered with linen sheets and several layers of heavy wool blankets topped in the coldest months with a coverlet lined with fur. But the truly essential feature, the one that made sleep possible at all in a room this cold, is the set of heavy curtains hung from a wooden frame surrounding the bed on all 4 sides. These curtains, woven from thick wool and sometimes lined with an additional layer of fabric for warmth, can be drawn fully closed once the occupants have climbed into bed, sealing the sleeping space off from the rest of the room almost entirely. The effect, once the curtains are drawn and the body heat of the sleepers begins to accumulate within that enclosed space, is something close to a small tent pitched inside a much larger, much colder room. The air within the curtained bed warms gradually through the night, trapped and recirculated by the fabric barrier, growing close and slightly stuffy in a way that a modern sleeper accustomed to climate-controlled bedrooms might find seriously uncomfortable. The difference between a tolerable night's sleep and a genuinely dangerous one. Outside those curtains, the solar continues its long nightly battle with the cold largely unwon. The hearth fire, banked down for the night to conserve fuel and reduce the risk of an unattended blaze, produces only a fraction of its daytime heat. The water in the basin, as we have discussed, may freeze solid before morning. The stone walls continue their patient, relentless radiation of accumulated cold into the room. But inside the curtained bed, in the small trapped pocket of warmed air that 2 bodies and several layers of wool wrapped together can generate and hold, something close to genuine warmth becomes briefly, precariously possible. Sir Robert sleeps poorly on the coldest nights, not from any failure of the curtained bed's basic design, but because his old hip injury aches worst, precisely when the temperature drops hardest, in the deep hours before dawn when even the trapped warmth inside the curtains has begun to fade. He shifts position often, trying to find an angle that eases the ache, and Lady Cecily, whose sleep is lighter than her husband's, after 11 winters of marriage, spent beside a man whose old injuries complain more insistently every year, wakes with him more often than either of them discusses. There is something worth recognizing in this small, private, entirely human detail. All the wealth and status this family commands, all the fine wool and expensive fur and imported tapestries, cannot buy Sir Robert a night, free of pain in January, any more than it can buy his household a room that stays properly warm from dusk until dawn. The curtained bed is in its own quiet way the most honest object in this entire castle. It is an admission, built directly into the furniture, that even the most powerful family within these walls cannot make an entire stone room warm through a northern winter night. They can only build a smaller temporary refuge within it, sealed off with fabric, and hope the body heat holds until morning. The construction of this refuge is more elaborate than a casual glance might suggest. The bed frame itself, along with its surrounding curtain structure, represents one of the more significant pieces of furniture in the household's inventory, transported with genuine effort whenever the family moves between their various properties, as noble households of this era frequently do throughout the year, following the agricultural and social calendar between different estates. The curtains alone, 4 substantial panels of heavy wool, sometimes lined with a second, lighter fabric layer for additional insulation, require careful maintenance against moth and damp, and represent, in their own right, a meaningful portion of the household's investment. Lady Cecily takes particular care with the bed's arrangement each evening, a small domestic ritual that she performs herself rather than delegating entirely to her attendants. Tucking the heaviest fur coverlet close around the edges of the mattress before the curtains are drawn, but searing no gap remains through which the accumulating warmth might escape too quickly into the colder room beyond. She learned this particular attention to detail from her own mother, who impressed upon her, during the early years of her own marriage, that a poorly sealed bed on a bitter night could mean the difference between genuine rest and a long, shivering night spent chasing sleep that would not properly come. It is a small skill, invisible to anyone outside the household, but it represents its own quiet form of expertise, the same working competence that governs Osbert's management of the kitchen stores, or Agnes's careful tending of a fire, simply applied to a different corner, the household's constant, collective effort against the season. The children of the household, when they are present, which this particular winter they are not, having been sent to complete their education in a relative's household further south, would traditionally sleep in a smaller curtained bed of their own, close enough to their parents' warmth to benefit indirectly from the room's marginally better heating without crowding the primary bed itself. This arrangement, common across noble households of this era, reflects the same underlying calculation that governs every sleeping arrangement in this castle, from the lord's curtain bed to the servants' shared pallets in the undercroft below. Proximity to warmth, wherever it can be found, and no matter how it can be generated, shapes nearly every decision about where and how a person spends the night. Which brings us down, at last, to the one place in this entire castle where the cold reliably loses. The kitchens sit on the ground floor of a separate range, connected to the great hall by a covered passage, positioned deliberately away from the main living quarters, both for safety, given the constant risk of fire, and for basic reasons of smoke and smell. If the great hall's central hearth struggles to warm a room of its size, the kitchens faced no such struggle at all. Between the great roasting fire, built into an open hearth, large enough for a grown man to stand inside if the flames were banked low enough, and the bread ovens, built into the thickness of the wall itself and fired to a heat that can bake dozens of loaves in a single session, the kitchens generate more sustained heat than any other space in the entire castle complex. This makes the kitchens, for anyone whose work brings them there, the single most physically comfortable place available in an otherwise relentlessly cold building. It also makes them a place of genuine occupational hazard, in ways that a modern kitchen, with its controlled electric or gas heat, simply does not replicate. The kitchen staff work in close proximity to open flame and superheated stone for hours at a time, in conditions that shift dramatically between the intense, sweat-inducing heat directly beside the roasting fire and the persistent, bone-deep chill of the stone floor under their feet, and the drafts that inevitably find their way in through the door to the yard, opened constantly as servants move between the kitchen and the wood store, the well, and the various pantries and storerooms that supply the household's food. Feeding a household this size through a northern winter is its own enormous logistical undertaking, one that runs in close parallel to the wood supply we have already discussed. By January, the fresh produce of autumn is long gone, replaced entirely by what the household managed to preserve and store through the harvest months. Grain, milled into flour for the daily bread that forms the backbone of every meal at every level of the household, from the coarse dark loaves served to servants to the finer white bread reserved for the high table. Salted and smoked meat, preserved through the autumn slaughter that reduces the household's livestock to a manageable number for winter feeding, while providing the stores that will need to last until spring. Onions and root vegetables held in cool, dry storage. Barrels of ale, brewed on the premises, which serves as the household's primary daily drink, since water quality in this era is inconsistent enough that ale with its brewing process is often considered the safer choice. The cook, a broad-weathered man named Osbert, who has run this kitchen for close to 20 years, manages this entire operation with an authority that even Sir Robert Stewart treats with genuine respect. Osbert's day begins before Agnes's does, tending the ovens that must be fired hours before the first bread can bake, and it does not end until the evening meal has been served, the fires banked, and the kitchen made ready for the following morning. He is in his own domain as skilled and as indispensable as any craftsman in the castle, managing not just the cooking itself, but the entire complex calculation of how far the household's winter stores need to stretch, adjusting portions and recipes. For Agnes, the kitchen represents the closest thing to real warmth she experiences during her working day, and also the sharpest contrast between comfort and its absence. She delivers wood to the kitchen ovens several times a day, and each visit means a few minutes standing in air that is thoroughly, properly warm, sometimes uncomfortably so near the roasting fire. A sensation so different from the rest of her working conditions that she has come to treasure these brief kitchen visits in a way that has nothing to do with the food itself and everything to do with the simple physical relief of feeling her hands and face grow warm rather than numb. And then, wood delivered, she steps back out into the passage, and the cold closes over her again within a few strides, as absolute and immediate as though the kitchen's warmth had been a dream. The meals that emerge from this kitchen, though far more limited and repetitive than any fantasy version of a medieval feast would suggest, represent their own form of quiet triumph over the season. A pottage of dried peas and preserved meat, thickened with barley and seasoned with whatever herbs remain from the household's dried stores, forms the backbone of most winter meals below the high table. Bread, always bread, in whatever quality the household's grain stores, and the day's occasion demand ale to drink. On feast days like the one we saw in the Great Hall, considerably more, elaborate fare, roasted meat, spiced wine, dishes that draw on stores set aside specifically for such occasions, but these represent genuine exceptions rather than the daily reality. which is far more monotonous, far more dependent on preserved and stored food, and far more focused on simple caloric sufficiency than on variety or pleasure. Every meal that leaves this kitchen, whether the humble pottage served to servants or the elaborate feast served to Sir Robert's guests, represents the successful outcome of an enormous continuous logistical effort stretching back through the autumn harvest and the slaughter and the brewing and the milling, underlying pressure of a winter that will not end for months yet, and a household that must be fed every single day, regardless of how much of that winter remains. Osbert's authority within this domain extends well beyond simple cooking. He is, in praxis, the household's primary manager of stored calories, responsible for calculating, on a rolling basis, whether the pantries and storerooms hold enough to reach spring without shortfall, and adjusting the household's daily consumption accordingly. This is not a task he performs with any written record beyond a few rough tallies scratched onto a wax tablet. It lives largely in his memory and his experience, built over 2 decades of managing this exact seasonal challenge, an intuitive grasp of how many days a given barrel of salted meat will realistically stretch, how many loaves a sack of flour will yield, how much slack exists in the household stores if an unexpected guest arrives, or if the winter runs longer than the calendar suggests it should. Osbert came to this position young, apprenticed to the previous cook as a boy of perhaps 9, and he has watched, over his 2 decades in this kitchen, a slow but steady accumulation of practical knowledge that no household document. He knows which barrels in the storeroom tend toward early spoilage based on which corner of the cellar they were stacked in. He knows that a particularly cold, dry winter preserves the meat stores better than a milder, damper one, regardless of what the almanac or the household's own hopeful expectations. This knowledge, accumulated through decades of close, attentive observation rather than any formal instruction, represents its own quiet form of mastery, invisible to anyone outside this kitchen, but utterly essential to the household's survival through every winter it has faced under his care. By late January, this calculation has begun to sharpen into genuine concern, though Osbert keeps that concern largely to himself and the steward, rather than voicing it openly to the wider household. The autumn's wet weather that delayed the wood harvest also affected the grain harvest, reducing the yield from the estate's fields by a margin that seemed manageable in October, and has grown steadily more worrying with each passing week of winter consumption. Osbert has already begun quietly stretching the household's bread further than he would prefer, mixing a portion of ground peas into the flour to extend the supply, a practice that produces a coarser, denser loaf that the servants notice without comment, because commenting on the food one is given is not a habit this household, and because everyone below the high table understands, without needing it explained, that a coarser loaf in January is simply what a difficult harvest looks like by the time it reaches the table. Agnes eats what she is given without much thought for its quality, her attention consumed as it is by the physical demands of her work rather than the subtleties of flavor. A bowl of pottage at midday, thick with peas and barley, and whatever preserved meat the kitchen can spare, eaten quickly and standing, because sitting for a proper meal is a luxury her schedule rarely accommodates. Bread in the morning, before the woodyard, and again in the evening, once the day's climbing is finally finished. It is enough to keep her working most days, though there are weeks in the deepest cold when even Osbert's careful management cannot quite close the gap between what the kitchen has to offer and what a body doing this much physical labor actually requires, and on those weeks, Agnes goes to sleep with a hunger that does not fully resolve, even after eating what the household provides. Osbert himself, watching Agnes eat standing at the edge of his kitchen on a morning like this one, sometimes slips her an extra heel of bread, or a spoonful of dripping beyond her allotted portion. A small kindness performed quickly and without comment, the way most kindnesses in this household are performed, folded into the ordinary business of the day rather than announced as generosity. He has watched enough winters pass through this kitchen to understand, in his own plain way, exactly how much a body like Agnes's burns through in a single day of wood hauling. And he has learned, too, the particular satisfaction of watching a hungry young servant eat a little more than the strict allowance would technically permit. A satisfaction that costs him almost nothing, and that he would never think to describe as compassion, though it plainly is. There is a version of the medieval past that likes to imagine its people as simply tougher than we are now, hardened by circumstance into a kind of cold resistance that modern comfort has supposedly bred out of us. It is a comforting story. It is also, on close examination, largely untrue. Cold, sustained over months in a stone building that never fully warms, takes a genuine and measurable toll on the human body, and the people of Harlow Castle in the winter of 1362 suffered from that toll in ways that were simply understood as the unavoidable price of the season, endured because there was no alternative, not because the suffering itself was somehow diminished by familiarity. Agnes's chilblains, the swollen, cracked, painfully itching patches across her knuckles and toes, are a direct physiological response to repeated exposure to cold, damp conditions, exactly the conditions her daily work in the woodyard and on the stairs guarantees. The affected skin, poorly circulated in the cold, and then rapidly rewarmed each time she steps briefly into a heated space like the kitchen, suffers a kind of repeated, small-scale tissue damage that leaves it permanently more vulnerable, itchier, and more painful with each passing week of winter. There is no real treatment available to her beyond keeping the affected skin as dry as possible, which her work makes nearly impossible, and applying whatever salve the household supplies allow, usually a preparation of rendered fat mixed with a few herbs believed to soothe irritated skin. It helps marginally. It does not cure anything. The chilblains will persist, worsening some weeks and easing slightly in others, until the weather finally turns in spring. Her cough follows a similar pattern every year, arriving with the deep cold of December and settling into her chest for the duration of the season. Modern medicine would likely identify a combination of factors at work: the wood smoke she breathes daily in the great hall and kitchens, the repeated cold exposure that stresses the respiratory system, and the general physical exhaustion that leaves the body's defenses running at less than full strength through months of hard labor and inadequate rest. Nobody in 1362 would describe it in those terms, but the practical reality is well understood regardless of the vocabulary available to describe it. Winter brings coughs. Coughs sometimes worsen into something more dangerous. And every household in this region has buried someone, at some point, whose winter cough deepened into a fever that did not break. This is the real, underlying fear that runs under the daily routine of castle life in deep winter, rarely spoken aloud, but constantly present. A serious respiratory illness in a stone building with no reliable heat, no medicine beyond herbal remedies and prayer, and no realistic prospect of travel to seek better care until the roads clear, is a seriously dangerous prospect for anyone in the household, regardless of rank. Sir Robert maintains a household physician of sorts, a man trained in the herbal and humoral medicine of the era, capable of preparing remedies for fever and pain, and capable, too, of bleeding a patient when the prevailing medical theory calls for it, but his actual ability to treat a serious lung infection is limited essentially to supportive care. Warmth where warmth can be found, rest where rest can be spared, and the hope that the patient's own constitution proves strong enough to recover without intervention. The drafts that the tapestries work so hard to block, the persistent cold that seeps through every gap in the stonework, despite every effort to seal it. represent a genuine and constant health hazard in this world, understood in practical, if not scientific terms, by everyone who lives here. A drafty sick room is recognized as dangerous for a patient already weakened by fever. A servant who works for hours in wet clothing, as Agnes frequently does given the dampness of freshly cut winter wood, is understood to be at greater risk of falling ill than one who can change into dry garments promptly. Though the household's limited supply of spare clothing means this understanding does not always translate into actual prevention. And this affliction, unlike so much else in this castle, does not respect the boundaries of rank in any meaningful way. Sir Robert's hip, the old hunting injury that aches with such persistence through the cold months, represents his own chronic winter suffering, different in its specific cause from Agnes's chilblains and cough, but identical in its fundamental nature. A body responding to sustained cold with pain. He has consulted physicians beyond his own household's man, has tried remedies suggested by visiting guests, has endured the same willow bark preparations available to any afflicted member of his household, and none of it has done more than marginally ease a pain that returns reliably every single winter, and that will likely worsen as he ages. Regardless of how many furs he wears or how large a fire burns in his solar, there is something worth sitting with in this particular truth. The cold that Agnes fights every day in the woodyard and on the freezing spiral stairs is the same cold that finds its way into Sir Robert's aching hip. 3 floors up, behind tapestries from Flanders, inside a curtained bed piled with fur. Neither of them can fully escape it. Both of them have simply learned in their own way to carry it, to work around it, to treat its daily presence as an unavoidable feature of the season rather than a problem with any real solution, because in the 14th century, in a stone castle in the north of England, in the deep months of winter, the household's understanding of illness and its treatment, filtered as it is through the medical theory of the era, rests on a framework of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and their proper balance within the body. Cold and damp conditions in this framework are understood to promote an excess of phlegm, which explains to a 14th century mind exactly why coughs and chest complaints multiply so reliably every winter. The physician's remedies follow logically from this theory, even where they strike a modern observer as ineffective or actively counterproductive. Warming herbs, taken in teas and tinctures, are prescribed to counteract the cold, damp humor believed to be accumulating in the chest. Bloodletting, when a fever runs high enough to suggest an excess of blood itself, is performed with a lancet and a basin, a treatment that a modern physician would recognize as actively harmful to a body already weakened by illness, but that represents, within the medical understanding of this era, a reasonable and considered intervention rather than a barbaric guess. Agnes has seen this treatment applied twice in her time at the castle. Once to a stable hand suffering a severe winter fever, and once, briefly and controversially, suggested for Sir Robert himself during a particularly bad flare of his hip pain, though Lady Cecily reportedly refused to permit it, trusting instead in warm compresses and patience. Decision that the household's physician accepted with visible reluctance, but did not openly contest, since questioning the lady of the house on a matter of her husband's care was not a position even a trained physician occupied comfortably. For the servants, medical care of any formal kind is a luxury rarely extended beyond the most basic remedies the kitchen and the household's small store of dried herbs can provide. A servant with a bad cough is given warming broth and instructed to rest when the work schedule permits it, which in the depths of winter, when every hand is needed for wood and water and food preparation, is not often. A servant with chilblains, like Agnes, receives salve if the household happens to have some prepared and continues working regardless, because the tasks she performs cannot simply pause until her hands heal, and because her hands, in truth, rarely have the chance to heal at all before the next day's cold and damp begins the cycle again. The fear that runs beneath all of this, quiet and constant, is the fear of the illness that does not resolve on its own. Every household in this region carries memories of winters when a fever swept through the servants' quarters or the village beyond the walls, taking the very young and the very old with a swiftness that no remedy, humoral or otherwise, could meaningfully slow. Agnes remembers from her own childhood in the village before she came to the castle, a winter when a fever took two of her playmates within the same week, an experience that left her with a quiet, private wariness around any cough that seems to be deepening rather than easing. A wariness she carries with her now every time her own chest tightens in the cold morning air of the woodyard. She has never spoken of this wariness to anyone in the household, not even to Joan, whose company she trusts more than almost anyone else's within these walls. It exists, instead, as a private background awareness, a small vigilance she keeps over her own body's signals, checking, almost without noticing she is doing it, whether this morning's cough feels the same as yesterday's, or whether something in its character has shifted towards something worse. So far, every winter, it has stayed the same, a familiar and tolerable companion rather than a genuine threat. He has learned not to assume this will always be the case, and she has learned too that there is little to be gained by dwelling on the possibility beyond this quiet, habitual monitoring, since worry changes nothing about what the winter itself will ultimately decide. By evening, the household has largely settled into its various corners, and the question of where everyone actually sleeps reveals its own quiet hierarchy, written not in any formal document, but in the simple physical geography of who gets to be warm and who does not. Sir Robert and Lady Cecily retire to their curtained bed in the solar, as we have already seen. Their few personal attendants, the higher-ranking servants who dress them and manage their private chambers, sleep nearby, often on truckle beds that slide out from under the main bed frame, or on pallets in an adjoining chamber, close enough to the solar's hearth to catch some benefit from its fading warmth through the night. Guests of sufficient rank are given chambers of their own, smaller than the solar but private, each with its own modest hearth if the household can manage it. And then there is everyone else. The cooks, the wood servants, the stable hands who are not needed through the night with the animals, the laundresses, the dozen or more menial workers whose labor keeps this entire castle functioning. For this group, which includes Agnes, the sleeping arrangements are considerably simpler and considerably warmer in one very specific and important sense. The kitchen undercroft, where Agnes and 6 others share the stone-vaulted room we visited at the start of this night, sits directly below the kitchens themselves, close enough to the great ovens above that some residual warmth filters down through the stone floor and the timber joists separating the two spaces. It is not, by any stretch, a warm room. The frost that Agnes found on the inside of the window opening this morning testifies to that clearly enough. But it is measurably less cold than the stairwells and passages elsewhere in the castle, and the servants who sleep here have found through generations of shared working wisdom passed down from one to the next, a further solution that costs nothing and requires no fuel at all. They sleep close together. The straw pallets in the undercroft are arranged not in the isolated private fashion a modern person might expect, each sleeper in their own designated space, but pushed close, sometimes touching, so that the servants sleeping here can share the warmth their own bodies generate through the night. This is not romantic in any sense, and nobody in this room would describe it that way. It is simply the most effective heat management strategy available to people who have no private hearth, no curtained bed, and no fur-lined coverlet. Only their own bodies and a shared understanding that 6 or 7 people sleeping close together in a stone room. Agnes sleeps between 2 other servants tonight, a scullery girl named Joan who is perhaps 15 and has worked in this kitchen for 3 years, and an older man named Hal who tends the castle's small livestock and whose steady, wheezing breath has become, over the 2 winters Agnes has slept beside him, a familiar and oddly comforting sound in the darkness. There is a kind of unspoken tenderness in this arrangement, that the formal records of castle life, focused as they are on the Lord's household accounts and the steward's ledgers, never think to mention. When Joan's feet grow too cold to bear, she tucks them against Agnes's legs without asking, and Agnes shifts to make room without being asked to, because this is simply how the Undercroft works, how it has always worked, and an unspoken agreement among people who have almost nothing else to offer each other except the heat of their own bodies and the willingness to share it. The Undercroft holds 7 sleepers on most winter nights, though the exact number shifts depending on the season's demands and whatever temporary labor the household has brought in. Beyond Agnes, Joan, and Hal, there is a laundress named Marjorie, older than the others by perhaps 20 years, whose hands, permanently reddened and roughened from years of cold water washing, she has learned to soothe with the same rendered fat salve that Agnes applies to her own chilblains. There are 2 younger boys, brothers named Wat and Robin, who help wherever the household needs an extra pair of hands, mucking stables one day and hauling water the next. Their labor unspecialized in the way that the youngest servant's work often is before a particular skill or aptitude sorts them into a more defined role. And there is a quiet, older man everyone calls simply Tom the porter, who tends the castle's main gate through the daylight hours and sleeps, once his watch ends, in the same shared warmth as the rest of them. This particular arrangement of bodies, this specific Undercroft with these specific people, represents something that the household's formal records, focused entirely on wages owed and duties assigned, never think to capture. Over the 2 winters, Agnes has slept in this room. A kind of unspoken family has formed among its occupants, built not from blood, but from a simple repeated experience of shared cold and shared relief from it. Marjorie, missing children of her own who died young years before Agnes was born, has taken to tucking a spare fold of blanket around Agnes's shoulders on the coldest nights, a small gesture performed without comment, received without thanks, because both understand it for what it is without needing to name it. Hal's steady, wheezing breath, which might unsettle a stranger, has become for Agnes an anchor point in the darkness, proof that the night is passing normally, that nothing has gone wrong. That morning will come the way it always comes. There is a particular ritual that has developed among this small group over the winters they have shared this space, one that Agnes could not say began deliberately, but that now happens most nights, without anyone announcing it. Before sleep fully takes hold, in the last few minutes, while the day's exhaustion is settling but has not yet won completely, someone in the room will say something small and ordinary into the darkness, a comment about the day's cold, a complaint about a particular ache, sometimes a fragment of a story or a memory from before the castle, before the winter, before whatever circumstance brought each of them to this specific stone room. Nobody is obligated to respond. Often, only a murmur or 2 answers before the room falls properly silent. But the ritual itself, this brief exchange of ordinary human voice before the exhaustion of the day, finally claims everyone present, has become, in its own small way, as essential to the Undercroft's function as the shared body heat itself. It reminds each of them on even the hardest days that they are not enduring this winter entirely alone. Before sleep takes her fully, Agnes reaches into the small pouch sewn inside her apron and finds the familiar shape of the carved wooden bird worn smooth now in places from 2 years of this exact gesture. She does not need to see it to know its shape, the folded wings, the tilted head. She presses her thumb against it, once the way she has done every night since her father carved it, and something in that small, private ritual settles her enough to let the exhaustion of the day finally take hold. The wind outside has picked up since dusk, audible even down here in the undercroft, as a low, steady moan around the castle's outer walls. Sound of a stone fortress standing firm against weather. Agnes has heard this sound every winter night of her life. Tonight, as every night, it carries her down into sleep rather than keeping her from it. A lullaby built entirely from the wind losing, over and over, against walls 12 feet thick. The wind does not stop. It rarely does in the deep weeks of a northern January, and by the time the household's last waking members have banked their fires and found their beds, snow has begun to fall across the castle, in earnest, thick and steady. The kind of snow that does not announce itself with drama, but simply accumulates, quietly, hour after hour, until the world beyond the walls has been entirely reshaped by morning. In the great hall, the last servant on duty rakes the ashes of the evening's fire into a careful mound over the remaining coals, a task performed with the same precision Agnes brings to her morning fire laying. Because banking a fire correctly through the night is the difference between a hall that can be quickly relit at dawn and one that must be built entirely from scratch in the freezing early hours. The coals glow faintly beneath their blanket of grey ash, a small, patient core of heat that will hold if the banking has been done correctly, until someone opens it again in the morning and coaxes it back to full flame. The tapestries hang still now, their hunting scenes and battle scenes and saints rendered invisible in the darkness, doing their quiet, insulating work, whether anyone is awake to appreciate the artistry or not. The long tables, cleared now of their feast night finery, sit empty in the dark, waiting for tomorrow's more modest meal. Somewhere above, in the roof timbers, the last thin traces of the day's wood smoke continue their slow drift toward the louvers, dissipating gradually into the night air outside. In the solar, 3 floors up that freezing spiral stair, Sir Robert and Lady Cecily lie behind their drawn curtains, the small warm pocket of air around them holding, for now, against the cold room beyond the fabric walls. Sir Robert's hip aches, as it always does in the deepest hours, a dull, familiar throb that he has learned to simply breathe through rather than fight. Somewhere in the castle's outer works, a watchman makes his rounds along the wall walk, stamping his feet against the cold, his breath fogging thick in the darkness, one of the few people in this entire complex still fully awake and moving through the small hours of the night. And downstairs from the kitchens, in the undercroft, Agnes and the others sleep in their close, warm huddle. The sound of the wind outside a distant, familiar presence rather than a threat, because tonight, as on most nights, the walls have held. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a stone castle once snow has begun to fall in earnest. A silence unlike anything the modern world, full of its constant background hum of traffic and electricity and distant voices. The snow muffles what little sound the winter landscape outside still carries, deadening the wind's usual howl into something softer, more distant. The thick stone walls, which have spent all day and all season working against the household's comfort, become, in this one specific way, a genuine mercy, sealing the interior of the castle off almost entirely from the world beyond, creating a silence so complete that a person lying awake in the deep hours might hear nothing at all except their own breathing and the faint, steady breathing of whoever sleeps closest beside them. This is the strange, quiet truth that sits underneath everything we have discussed tonight. A medieval castle in deep winter was, by any reasonable modern standard, a truly difficult place to live. Cold beyond what most people alive today have ever experienced indoors. Smoky, drafty, despite every tapestry and every effort to seal every gap. Physically demanding for the servants who kept its fires fed and its household functioning, and only marginally more comfortable for the lord and lady whose wealth brought them slightly less misery. It is worth pausing before we move toward this evening's final reflections to consider how thoroughly this particular truth has been buried beneath centuries of accumulated romance. The Victorian era, which did more than any other period to shape the modern popular image of the medieval past, took a particular delight in reimagining castles as settings for chivalric grandeur, commissioning paintings and restoring ruined keeps into picturesque follies designed for aesthetic pleasure rather than historical accuracy. The Gothic revival architects of that century, building their own fantasy castles for wealthy patrons, incorporated all of the visual drama, the towers, the arrow slits, the great halls, while quietly correcting every one of the actual discomforts we have spent this evening exploring. Adding proper chimneys and glazed windows and modern heating wherever their patrons' comfort required it. The result, replicated in countless later films and novels, and now in the algorithm-driven aesthetics of modern social media, is a castle that looks authentically medieval while functioning nothing like one, a beautiful stage set built from genuine historical details but stripped entirely of the genuine historical discomfort those details actually produced. And yet, on a night like this one, with the snow falling thick and silent outside walls 12 feet thick, with the great hall fire banked to a careful, patient glow, with Sir Robert and Lady Cecily warm enough behind their curtains, and Agnes warm enough between Joan and Hal, in the undercroft below, there is something that everyone inside these walls, from the highest rank to the lowest, shares completely without any distinction of status at all. They have survived another day of it. And for tonight, at least, the walls have held, and the cold, for a few hours, has lost. By morning, the snow will have transformed the entire landscape beyond the castle walls into something almost unrecognizable, softening the harsh lines of the outer wall and the gatehouse and the frozen moat into gentle white curves, a landscape that will look to anyone gazing out from a high window as though the world itself had chosen overnight to set aside its harshness. The watchman on the wall walk, relieved from his post as the earliest grey light appears, will report the depth of the new snow to the steward, who will factor it immediately into the day's calculations, whether the roads remain passable for any planned journey, whether the extra snow load on the roof timbers requires any inspection, whether the wood supply, already stretched thinner than the household would prefer, will need to stretch further still if the snow delays any planned deliveries from the estate's outlying farms. None of this will be visible in the scene that greets Agnes when she wakes still in darkness to begin the cycle again. She will rise from her straw pallet, careful not to disturb Joan or Hal or the others still sleeping, and she will make her way up through the kitchen, where Osbert is already stirring the ovens back to life, and out into the woodyard, where the fresh snow will lie deep and undisturbed across the stacked timber, requiring her to clear a path before she can even begin the day's first loads. She will press her thumb against the small wooden bird in her apron pocket, a brief, private gesture before the labor begins. Then she will begin exactly as she began yesterday and the day before and every day since October, carrying wood, climbing stairs, feeding fires she will not sit beside until this particular winter, like every winter before it, finally, eventually, releases its grip on this castle, the people who call it home. Step back now for a moment, From the woodyard, and the spiral stairs, and the frozen basin mortar, and the curtained bed, and look at the whole shape of what we have actually described tonight. Because there is a pattern running underneath every single one of these details, and once you see it clearly, you will never look at a romantic image of castle life quite the same way again. The first pattern is this: the very architecture that made a castle, the thick stone walls, the narrow defensive windows, the massive fortifications designed to repel armies, was precisely the architecture that made it so miserable to live inside during winter. This was not an oversight. It was not a failure of medieval engineering that a more thoughtful builder could have easily corrected. It was a direct, unavoidable trade-off. Every design choice that made Harlow Castle nearly impossible for an enemy to breach also made it nearly impossible to heat. Thick stone absorbs and holds cold with the same stubborn efficiency it uses to absorb the impact of a siege engine. Narrow windows that deny an attacker a way in also deny the household natural light and easy ventilation for the smoke of their own fires. The castle's strength, in the most literal architectural sense, was also its household's constant enemy. Nobody in the 14th century had the luxury of solving both problems at once, and given a choice between a warm home and a defensible one, in a world where raids and sieges were a real and present danger, the choice was never really in question. The second pattern is this: comfort inside these walls was never a fixed destination that money could simply purchase outright. It was a spectrum running from bitterly, dangerously cold at one end to marginally, tolerably less cold at the other, and every single person in this castle, from Sir Robert in his fur-lined solar to Agnes in the woodyard, lives somewhere along that spectrum without ever fully escaping it. Wealth moved a person further along that spectrum, bought thicker fur, a smaller and more efficient private hearth water that froze more slowly, a curtained bed that trapped warmth more effectively. Wealth did not, and in this century, this climate, and this architecture could not deliver anyone all the way to what a modern person would simply call warm. Sir Robert's aching hip, throbbing behind his tapestries and his fur, is the physical proof of this. His wealth softened his winter. It did not end it. The third pattern, and perhaps the most important one, is this: whatever warmth existed anywhere inside this castle was never ambient. It was never simply present, the way heat flows automatically from a modern furnace through ductwork into every room of a house without anyone needing to think about it. Every measure of warmth inside Harlow Castle, from the roar of the great hall hearth to the modest glow of the solar fire to the trapped, shared body heat inside a curtained bed or a huddle of sleeping servants, existed because someone, somewhere, for the entire length of a season that lasted 5 months or more, the moment that labor stopped, even briefly, the cold returned immediately and without mercy. This is the fact that the romantic image of castle life is most determined to hide, because acknowledging it means acknowledging the army of exhausted people, Agnes and Joan and Hal and Osbert and dozens of others whose names history never bothered to record, whose relentless daily labor was the actual, literal source of every comfort the household above them enjoyed. And there is a fourth pattern worth naming plainly, because it connects everything else. The people who made this castle's winter survivable, who hauled the wood and tended the fires and carried the water and stacked the timber, have been almost entirely erased from the popular image of what castle life actually looked like. When the modern imagination pictures a medieval castle, it pictures the great hall in its finest moment, the feast, the tapestries glowing, the fire roaring, and it populates that image with lords and ladies, with knights and minstrels, with the visible, recorded, celebrated inhabitants of the story. It does not picture Agnes on the spiral stairs at 5 in the morning, her hands cracked and bleeding, a 50-pound load of wet oak pressed against her chest, climbing toward a fire she will never sit beside. But without Agnes, and without every servant like her, across every castle of this era, there would be no great hall feast to romanticize in the first place. There would only be cold stone and darkness, and a household slowly freezing inside its own impressive, impregnable, unheatable walls. Consider, too, what this pattern reveals about the historical record itself, about why Agnes's version of this winter has taken 600 years to reach anyone at all. The documents that survive from households like Harlow Castle, the account rolls, the household ordinances, the occasional personal letter were written by and for the literate few, the stewards and clerks and lords themselves, people whose daily concerns ran toward rents collected and provisions purchased, guests entertained. A steward's account roll might record, in a single dry line, the purchase of a given quantity of firewood for a given sum, a transaction that represents, in Agnes's daily experience, hundreds of individual trips up a freezing staircase, hundreds of hours of chapped hands and aching shoulders. The document survives. The lived experience behind it does not, except in the rare, indirect traces that historians and archaeologists have learned to read between the lines of what does survive, the skeletal evidence of joint damage in servants' remains, the household accounts that hint at the sheer scale of winter fuel consumption, the occasional surviving illustration that shows, almost incidentally, a servant bent under a load of wood, in the background of a scene meant to celebrate something else entirely. This is not a unique failing of medieval record-keeping. It is a pattern that repeats across nearly every era of human history, the tendency of the historical record to preserve the experience of the powerful, vivid detail, while reducing the experience of the laboring majority to inference, archaeology, and educated guesswork. Agnes will not appear in any surviving document from Harlow Castle. Her name, if it appears at all, will appear once perhaps in a wage roll, listing a small sum paid to a wood servant, a single line among hundreds, indistinguishable from the entries above and below it. Sir Robert and Lady Cecily, by contrast, will appear repeatedly in land records and legal documents, and perhaps, if the family's fortunes hold, in a memorial brass or a tomb effigy that some future visitor to a parish church will study centuries from now, wondering what their lives were actually like. The truth, as we have spent this evening discovering, is that their lives were considerably less comfortable and considerably more similar to Agnes's own daily reality than any tomb effigy or memorial brass could ever suggest. Sir Robert's aching hip and Agnes's chapped hands were both, in their own way, casualties of the same unsolvable architectural problem, the same relentless January cold that no wealth in this county could fully purchase its way out of. The historical record remembers one of them in stone and brass. It barely remembers the other at all. But the cold, on any given night in January 1362, did not care about that distinction, neither, in the end, unless someone pulls the curtain back and looks at both of them clearly, together in the same freezing castle on the same winter night, which is what we have done tonight. Let us return one last time to where we began. The feast, the gleaming silver and the roaring fire and the tapestries glowing deep red, gold in the torchlight. You know things now that you did not know when we first stood in that hall together. You know that the smoke from that roaring fire has nowhere proper to go, that it hangs in a thickening haze above the tables, stinging eyes and coating the roof beams black. You know that the fire's warmth barely reaches the guests seated 20 feet away, and does not reach the servants standing along the far wall at all. You know that the tapestries glowing so richly on the walls are doing quiet, essential work as insulation, standing between this gathering and a draught that would otherwise cut through the hall at ankle height and shoulder height alike. You know about the basin of water, freezing solid, 3 floors up, in the private chamber of the wealthiest family in the room. You know about the curtained bed, that small warm tent built inside a cold stone room because no fire, however large, could warm the room itself. You know about Sir Robert's aching hip, and about the chilblains on Agnes's hands, and about the cough that will not leave her chest until spring. And most of all, you know about the wood, about the staggering forest-level quantity of timber this single feast and this single castle and this single winter actually required, about the servants who chopped it and hauled it and carried it up freezing spiral stairs, load after load, day after day, so that this room could glow the way it glows tonight. About Agnes specifically, 17 years old, small and strong and exhausted, who fed every fire in this castle today and sat beside almost none of them. Look at the hall again. Now, with all of that knowledge sitting quietly behind your eyes, it does not look false. It does not look like a lie that has been exposed. It looks, if anything, more remarkable than it did before, because now you understand what it actually cost to create this single evening of warmth and light and comfort inside a building whose fundamental architecture worked against comfort at every turn. The gleam of that fire is not effortless. It is the visible result of an entire household's relentless, coordinated, physically brutal labor against a season that never stops trying to get in. Think for a moment about what tomorrow holds for everyone we have spent this evening with. Sir Robert will wake in his curtained bed, his hip aching in the way it always aches when the cold has settled deepest overnight, and he will rise and dress in his heavy wool and fur, and he will spend his day managing an estate that depends, in ways he understands only partially, on the exhausted labor of dozens of people whose names he could not reliably list if asked. Lady Cecily will oversee the household's daily business, the food stores, the laundry, the endless small administrations that keep a castle of this size functioning. Work is its own form of relentless labor, different from Agnes's in its particulars, but no less constant in its demands. And Agnes will wake before dawn in the same undercroft, beside the same sleeping companions, and she will climb the same freezing spiral stairs the same number of times, carrying the same wet oak, feeding the same fires she will not sit beside, because tomorrow is simply another January day, indistinguishable. And from yesterday, and from every day, stretching back to October and forward to April. This is not a tragedy in the way a modern viewer might be tempted to frame it, and framing it that way would do a disservice to Agnes and to everyone like her across every castle of this era. She does not experience her life as a tragedy. She experiences it as Tuesday, the same way Margaret Hollis, half a world away and 500 years in the future, experienced her own relentless frontier labor, as simply the shape of an ordinary day. There is dignity in this, a dignity that has nothing to do with how comfortable or difficult the circumstances were, and everything to do with the sheer, quiet competence with which Agnes meets each of those circumstances day after day without complaint, without any expectation that her labor will ever be recorded or remembered. Doing what needs to be done, because it needs to be done, and because she is the one positioned to do it. A medieval castle in deep winter was a masterpiece of stone and defense, and it was by any honest measure a genuinely difficult place to try to stay warm. It required a small army of exhausted people hauling timber up freezing stairs, feeding fires they would rarely sit beside, simply to keep the chill from settling permanently into the bones of everyone who lived within these walls. Rich and poor alike were bound by the same smoke, the same draughts, the same relentless dark of January. Sir Robert's hip and Agnes's hands ached from the same cold, in different rooms, for different reasons that were, underneath it all, the same reason. The version of the past we have inherited, the one built by later centuries who needed the medieval world to look a certain way for their own purposes, has done a genuine disservice to the actual people who lived through winters like this one. It has flattened Agnes into an extra in someone else's story, if it remembers her at all, and it has flattened Sir Robert and Lady Cecily into figures of untroubled grandeur, when the truth, as we have spent this evening discovering, was considerably more textured, considerably more difficult, and considerably more human than either flattening allows. But tonight, the heavy oak doors are barred. The great hall fire has been banked, its embers glowing faintly beneath their blanket of ash, patient and small, waiting for morning. The endless, freezing labor of feeding every hearth in this castle has, for a few hours, finally stopped. Agnes sleeps between Joan and Hal in the warm dark of the undercroft, her thumb resting against the small carved bird in her apron pocket. Sir Robert and Lady Cecily sleep behind their curtains, 3 floors up, the trapped warmth of their small shared tent holding against the cold room beyond the fabric. And outside, the snow keeps falling, thick and silent, sealing the entire castle off from the world beyond its walls, in a hush so complete it feels for these few hours, almost like peace. And you, whatever cold winds you had to face today, whatever heavy loads you had to carry up your own steep stairs, you are inside now. The walls are thick. You are safe from the draught. The fire has been banked, and the embers are glowing quietly beneath the ash, and they will hold until morning. The lamps are low. The fire is banked, but truth has been told. Sleep well, friend.